Hello everyone, my name is Juan Camilo Muñoz, and today with my group, conformed by Daniela Pedrosa, Isabela Gamboa, Jan Quintero, and me, we are going to be talking to you about a very interesting topic, which is teaching and assessing writing. We are going to be focusing on teaching and assessing writing in the first and second language classroom. But the principles that we are going to show throughout the presentation can be applied to any other subject and any other class. Okay, to begin, we have decided to divide the presentation in 5 parts so the information is clearer and we can answer as many questions as possible. So, in the first part, important conceptual aspects, I am going to be talking to you, as I mentioned, about important conceptual aspects that are fundamental to understand writing and understand how to teach it and assess it. In the second part, methodological aspects, Daniela is going to talk to you about some methods and approaches that can be helpful when you want to do a class regarding writing or when you want to assess a class and the writing skill. In the third part, Jan is going to talk to you about how to evaluate a writing skill, and he is going to show us the parts that an evaluation of writing should have and should not have. And finally, Isabella is going to take charge of the last 2 parts of the presentation. In the fourth part, the example, she is going to show us a sample of a writing test or a writing task and is going to show us if it accomplished the goals set by the authors of the readings that we found about the subject. And then she is going to give us some conclusions about the whole presentation, but more specifically about the example and her opinions about the example that she gave. Moving on to the first part, my part. And in this part, I am going to talk about, as I mentioned before, important conceptual aspects. Well, to do this in a more organized manner, I am going to answer these following questions. The first one, what is considered written production in L2? The second, what is taught to people to write in a foreign language? The third, what aspects affect L2 written production? And finally, I am going to answer the question, what types of writing and text exist? So before we start to answer the main question, which is, what is considered written production in second language? We need to ask another important question. Why is it important to define the concept of writing and written production in a second language? Well, we need to define this because many times teachers and us, we don't know what writing and written production is, and we cannot fairly teach or evaluate something that we don't know what is. So, what is writing anyways? What is writing? Is it how well students are able to use rhetorical modes or rhetorical resources, like for example a hyperbole or a metaphor? Is it how well people are able to have coherent ideas interconnected to create a piece of writing? Or can it be the capacity of reading or redacting the texts that follow a pre-established structure and style, for example, an essay? Is writing or written production just knowing how to do an essay, for example, that has the introduction, the arguments, and the conclusion? Is that knowing how to write? Is that written production? Well, it turns out that all of the things that I mentioned before are part of the concept of writing and written production, but it's not everything that there is to the concept. What I mean by this is that writing is not just one thing, and as anything related to teaching and anything related to humans, the concept can change from person to person. And why is that? Because the context is important when you are trying to define writing. For example, writing is not the same for a student, a university student, than to a person in social media. For example, for one, it is written production is part of their field, their work, and for the other, it is just part of their leisure. And in the text, we are going to find that written production has two main definitions in the text that we read. And the first one is during the basic levels. And during the basic levels, reading is basically seen as a tool to review the structures and vocabulary learned in class. For example, in the lower levels of a language classroom, you are going to find teachers that give you the following prompt. Describe your last vacations using simple past and the following list of words related to traveling. And many times, if you pay attention, you're going to find that the answers that the students give, the writing that they produce, is just a repetition of the same formula. For example, on my last vacations, I went to Cartagena. I used sunscreen. I went to a bar. So you see, it's like repeating the same structure. So they're practicing the structures and they're practicing the vocabulary. And during the more advanced levels, we are going to find that writing is the clear and accurate expression of ideas, focusing on grammatical structures and language forms and lexic. For example, in the higher levels, you are going to find that teachers often use essays and give students work related to their argumentative power. So in this way, the students are able to express freely. Moving on to the next question, what is taught to people to write in a foreign language? We need to stop. Before learning about the things that are taught to students when learning how to write both in their first and second language, it is important to recognize the difference between the environments in which they learn to write. This means understanding that there exist some differences among learning to write in a physical classroom and a virtual one. For instance, in a virtual space, students are very limited as they mainly interact with the teacher. This becomes an unequal relationship of power. Even when they have more resources to help the writing process, it can be more difficult for them as they don't get to interact with their peers. And in contrast, an in-person space allows for a more natural interaction that gives students the lead of the class, and where the teacher only interferes when needed. He becomes an agent of control, not the dictator, for example, per se. As mentioned in the previous point, it is important to have a contextualized learning experience for the students. And in this way, it will be a meaningful way to expand their knowledge and help them to improve in their written expression. For this, the teacher must take into account aspects as the reasons the students are learning to write in the L2, in what context the students are going to be writing, and what tools do they use for writing. Because you can teach something that is not going to be useful for the students. It is equally important to take into account the following list of basics. We are always going to find that in writing in a foreign language, where teachers are going to teach people the following things. The first one being grammar. Grammar, it is important to be taught to students because it is the basis of the language, especially when they will be involved in the educational or professional contexts. For example, grammar is a great way to promote writing in a foreign language, as it helps students to recognize the differences between both languages and their structures. The next thing is formal correctness. The way in which one writes must be conditioned to the kind of public that one has. It is not the same to write a message to a friend than to write a thesis, for example. The student must always take into account the public that he or she is going to have. Another aspect that is fundamental to teach to write in a foreign language is the use of different formats that can vary from language to language. For example, it is not the same to write an essay in Spanish than writing an essay in English. And finally, and this can apply to writing in any subject, writing is a process. It is always taught to students that writing is a process. It is important to remark that many times you need more than one attempt to write a text, and this is very important because writing can be a very frustrating activity. So the next question is, what aspects affect second language written production? We have two kinds, positively and negatively. Beginning with the positive, and the first aspect that affects second language written production positively is acknowledging the student's needs. When a teacher is able to talk to his students or her students and analyze their needs, it is easier to create tasks that are effective in writing and that are not stressful for the students. When you create stressful tasks for students in writing, they can easily lose interest in them. And this brings us to the second point, which is well-designed writing task. When you design a writing task taking into account the needs of students, you can help them to improve the things that may be frustrating for them, for example, in vocabulary or grammatical structures, and you can target that. And as Christian mentioned before, when in his theory of language, when you give students a task or when you teach people in a way that is not stressful for them, you are able to help them to improve in an easier manner. Then we have the negative aspects. The first one is not having enough feedback. Writing is not a one-way task, is not a one-way activity. So when you have feedback with your students, it can help them to develop more skills, because many times students have mistakes that they don't realize they have until someone else points them out. So when you have a feedback session with them, when giving them writing tasks, you are affecting their writing process and their writing ability in a positive way, because you help them to correct those mistakes. Then we have taken uninformed decisions. When you ignore the needs of students, you fall into a mistake, because Dornier says that motivation is driven by necessity. And if you give students a task that is not related to their necessities or their reality, they are going to feel demotivated to do it, and they're going to ultimately lose interest in writing and lose interest in practicing, and then they are not going to be able to develop their written production in the second language or in their first language. Well, to finish with my portion, what types of writing or text exist? There are many types of writing, but many decide to categorize them in three main categories. First, the expository text. This category includes the texts that are the most used in the world. This category has 5 subdivisions. First one is description, where the author describes a topic. Then we have the procedure or sequence, that the name says it all. Then we have the comparison, where the author explains how 2 or more objects are alike. And we have cause and effect explanation and problem solution presentation. Next, we have the narrative text. A narrative text entertains. That is the main idea of a narrative text. It instructs or informs readers by telling a story. Narrative texts deal with the imaginary or real world and can be fictional, for example, fairy tales, novels, science fiction, horror, adventures, etc., etc. And the non-fictional portion of narrative text include articles, newspaper reports, and many other types of texts. And finally, we have the argumentative text that, as the name say, aim to change the reader's beliefs. And they often contain negative qualities of or characteristics of something or someone to try to persuade the readers that an object, product or idea is in some way better than others.
Hello, my name is Daniela, and moving on with the presentation, we will discuss the methodological aspects present in teaching L2 writing. We already know that L2 writing is a term applied to the writing practices done in a language different from the writer's native language. In this section, we will take a look at the principles involved in teaching L2 writing, as well as the structuring of writing tasks regarding the approaches or focuses of writing. In this way, L2 writing refers not only to the product but also how it is taught, analyzed, and learned. Therefore, there is a vast variety of perspectives on L2 writing, from ESL, TESOL teachers, applied linguistics, composition, and translation, as well as teachers working with particular language groups in a range of contexts. This points us the fact that it is not only the writing where it is interesting and complex, but also the writers themselves. It is clear that conceptions of writing and teaching influence teaching practices in L2 classrooms. So there are mainly two perspectives that we should keep in mind when it comes to teaching L2 writing. First, the sociocultural theory or perspective, with the multilingual, critical, and contextualized perspectives, and the digitalization of writing with all the potentialities offered by computers and the net itself. Learning and teaching L2 writing is conceived as a complex process, since it is not only about acquiring discourse or grammatical structures, but also being able to adopt the appropriate attitude and role, and to understand the pragmatical and cultural aspects that derive from each communicative practice. Moreover, L2 writing teachers also deal with the transference that may exist between the L1 and L2, in which students or learners try to express themselves as the way they do it in their native languages by finding equivalents in the L2. But this process may trigger some corrections that cancel out one or the other of the languages. For that reason, it is important for us as teachers to be more aware of the rhetorical particularities of our students' native language, and thus correct their writings more cautiously, trying to respect the rhetorical features of their mother tongue. On the one hand, sociocultural perspective states that writing is not a process, a static process over time. On the contrary, it is a practice that varies according to the social context in which it is presented or produced, and that it is at the same time interrelated with other modes, such as speech. That is why in communication, whether oral or written, each speech act may acquire a different or a particular meaning depending on the speech community where it is produced, the conditions in which it occurs, and the cultural elements involved in the process. For example, the concept of complaining varies according to the speech community and the cultural norms in which it is produced. In some countries, complaining might take on the sense of a claim, while in others it is seen just as providing feedback. Another principle that should be taken into account when teaching L2 writing are the learning difficulties and the literate practices developed by illiterate adults or those with low level of schooling. In both cases, learners give priority to orality, so that the writing practices are affected or simply non-existent. Therefore, the importance of writing is presented not only as a communicative skill, but also as an epistemic and mnemotechnic tool, as well as its link to the learner's learning style. In this sense, teachers should be more aware of the complexity of teaching learning to write in a second language to people who are accustomed to writing in a different speech community that has literary practices that might be equivalently named but often contains diverse uses and might use uses and values and might use a very different writing system. In the same way, teachers should recognize the importance of writing as a learning tool for students and the different uses that they can make of it. On the other hand, the evolution of writing practices has brought the use of the internet as a methodological tool in the teaching of writing. Nowadays, new technologies allow the use of different discursive genres through new resources and at the same time have taken the teaching of writing from the delimited physical space to a more complex and diverse dimensions such as virtuality. Besides, in the teaching of writing intervene not only the physical and virtual resources, but also the personal learning environment and the social networks managed by learners and with the occasional intervention of teachers. Technological resources such as blogs, forums, or chats have become support tools for teaching L2 writing. However, as teachers, we should promote the use of such resources not only in the writing practices that take place in the classroom, but also as tools for the autonomous learning of writers. In the same way, we should promote the social aspects that are involved in the writing practices, such as the collaborative work and the social networks. Now that we have mentioned the principles involved in teaching L2 writing, let's take a look at the structure of a writing lesson. The structuring of a writing lesson depends on several factors, including the writing approach taken. Some of the factors that intervene in the structuring of a lesson are subject matter, the theme students have to write about, input material or prompt, that is, with which students will create their tasks. It could be a reading, it could be another kind of text, it could be images. Also, the time students are given to carry out the activity, the cognitive demand, that are the skills that are needed to carry out the task, and the mode that students are asked to use, rather physical or digital. In the case of the given prompt, it is important to clarify that not all prompts are the same. Thus, all students will perform in a different way according to them. For example, for some students, it might be easier to write about personal experiences than for others. And the product of these tasks, personal experiences, might be more convenient in some cases than in others. So, it is the teacher's role to determine which prompts are appropriate for the context in which they are teaching and according to their students' needs. The following aspects should also be taken into account in the preparation of writing tasks. First, topic, text, and contexts. The choice of contexts, purposes, and target audience, texts, genres, length, and tone, and the topics of the task is fundamental to increase or decrease the student's motivation in writing. They must be adapted to both the particular interests of the group and also the curriculum indications for the task. Second, models and prior reading. Production tasks usually include textual materials that serve as input for the students to prepare in priority to the writing task. For example, if we are working on a formal email, the task begins by reading examples of emails. Or if we are working on a newspaper or a news item, we can listen to the radio, watch TV news, read newspapers, so the student can see the particularities of each genre and mode before starting their own production. And third, cognitive processes. It is said that a competent writer should be able to transfer their knowledge from the L1 to the L2, thus implementing processes such as planning, looking for ideas, making a plan, writing, drafting, writing paragraph by paragraph, linking previous ideas, and revising, checking grammar, refining tone, and those aspects that are important in the revision of a test. In this way, a writing task becomes a small sequence of work with subtasks of planning, writing, and revising that guide the student or the learner more closely and clearly. When structuring a writing task, it is also necessary to take into account the social component that is involved in writing because writing is a social task. And in terms of learning and teaching, collaborative work is really beneficial for learners. Likewise, it is valuable that in the process of writing, teachers allow the use of the L1 without penalizing it, favor and encourage collaborative planning and revision, and incorporate multimodality in the writing process. In order to deepen the structuring of a writing lesson, it is necessary to talk about the approaches that guide the L2 writing teaching. These approaches rely on theories that guide the L2 writing process around different focus: functional, content, structural, expressive, etc. Few teachers strictly follow just one of these orientations in their classrooms. Instead, they adopt a wide range of methods, accommodating their practices to their teaching situation and how they believe that students learn to write. So, the first focus is the focus on the structure. This conception describes writing as a product, and it is focused on grammar and the linguistic units of texts. In this particular view, learning L2 writing mainly involves linguistic knowledge, vocabulary choices, syntactic patterns, cohesive devices that comprise the building blocks of a text. So, an emphasis on language structure in teaching writing is a four-stage process, basically. First, familiarization. Learners are taught some grammar, especially from reading closely some pre-established texts. Second, control writing. So, learners manipulate some fixed patterns, especially from substitution, in order to practice a little bit what they learned previously. Then, they have guided writing, in which they have a model text and they imitate it. And the last part is the free writing, in which students or learners use all the things they have learned in the process to create a product by themselves, such an essay or a letter. Writing is done through guiding compositions in which students are asked to fill in the gaps, complete sentences, transform tenses or personal pronouns, and complete other exercises in short texts. The focus or the aim of these kinds of activities is to focus students on achieving accuracy and avoiding errors. Although many L2 learners have learned to write in this way, the structural orientation can create serious problems. The goal of writing instruction can never just be focusing on accuracy and explicitness, because written texts are always a response to a particular communicative setting. Next, perspective is focused on functions. Particular language forms perform certain communicative functions, and in this approach, learners are taught the most relevant functions to their needs. This approach is focused on broad text types and how language is used to do certain things through writing, such as describing, narrating, or reporting. This is achieved by assisting students to create effective paragraphs to produce those types of texts, showing them, for example, how to create supporting sentences, topic sentences, transitions, and by creating different kinds of paragraphs. Students are guided to produce connected sentences. That is done through tasks that focus on form in order to reinforce model writing patterns. These kinds of activities are always similar to the sentence level activities, in which students reorder scrambled paragraphs or complete paragraphs that have gaps, or that they write paragraphs from given information. The last focus is on creative expression. In the third orientation, the writer, not the text, is the point of departure. From this perspective, writing is learned, not taught. So, the writing instruction is non directional and personal. In this focus, writing is a way of sharing meanings, and writing courses emphasize the power of the individual to create his or her own views on a topic. Thus, writing is seen as an act, a creating act of self discovery. Teachers see their role as simply to provide students with the space to make their own meanings within a positive and a cooperative environment. Teachers, in this perspective, focus on answering or attending the learners' ideas instead of correcting their grammatical errors. But also, they provide them with all the necessary exercises and activities in order to reinforce features such as style, wordiness, cliches, the use of active or passive voice, among other writing patterns. And that's all for the methodological aspects in L2 writing.
Well, after seeing important aspects of writing, the different types of writing and the different types of text, also some methodological aspects about how to teach this skill. Now it's time to explore how to assess students' writing ability. It's important to know that what theory and research found about this topic, because it's really common that teachers have a lot of doubts in when assessing students' writing skills. Even the most experienced ones, even the teachers that thinks that they know a lot of their students, have a lot of doubts when assessing them. So it is important to explore those doubts that relies in different issues that we will explore it. The first issue is the nature of writing ability, because it is important to define the focus of the assessment, the focus of the corrections, the focus of the evaluation, because it is not the same evaluate for higher level students to lower level students. The context is really different, and we have to take it to have this context in mind always. And the focus will be different in those contexts. We will see it later. Another important issue is whether or when to test. The traditional test with limited time, it's not the best option always, and there are other kinds of other tools to assess students' grading skills, and we will explore it later. But it is important to remember and to highlight that sometimes it's important to include or to do a traditional test, because students maybe will need it, but sometimes it's not the best option to portray the students' grading skills. And the last issue is the qualities of a good test, because it is important that a test have the three important aspects: that the test is reliable, is valid, and is practical for the teacher, because we are the teachers and it's important that aspect to take it in mind when creating grading task. Well, the first important issue that have to be taken into account when assessing students' grading skills is grading ability. This issue could be understood or explored with the question how to evaluate depending on the grading ability. Because it is not the same for all students and there are different views when assessing. We as teachers, for example, could be more focused on the correct use of vocabulary, the correct use of grammatical structures, for example. But we could be also more focused on the correct organization of ideas or the content development in a text. The use of connectors, for example. There are different views, and we will see that it depends on the level. On one hand, we have the lower levels of instructions. In those levels, writing is seen as a support to practice the vocabulary and the structures taught in class. The focus is not that students learn how to write perfectly, let's say. The focus is that students could show that they learn the new vocabulary, they know how to use it, they acquire the basic knowledge to use one structure or another. How to employ the new vocabulary. That's the focus in lower levels of instruction. Why? It is because they are acquiring some basic skills in the foreign language. They are acquiring those skills. So grading is not the most important or the focus here. The focus are the basic skills. On the other hand, we have higher levels of proficiency in the L2. They already developed the skills, the basic skills I already mentioned before in the lower levels of instruction. So the focus here is that they know how to write. They learn how to write depending on the context. For example, they learn how to write in a specific context. They learn how to write depending on the text, the type of text, depending on the goal of the text. Those are the focus in higher levels because they are already acquired those basic skills. Also, we have that the focus is on content development. For example, in an essay, that students could express their arguments properly with a lot of evidence, for example, and also the organization of ideas. The ideas are not mixed. The paragraph structure is accurate, and we could conclude that lower levels in lower levels the focus is on microstructure of the text. We have vocabulary, grammar, and in higher levels the focus is on macrostructure. We have coherence and cohesion. For example, it will be more developed in the next slide. Also, we have assessment. And answering the question, why do teachers assess their students? Because the objective is to help them to write better. That's the main goal. And in order to do that, teachers use different assessment tools in order to develop their writing skills. We have, for example, tutorials in which the idea is that teacher follows follows up the grading process, helping those who have difficulties, approving drafts, and it's important that this process is constant and do it from time to time. Okay. We have also the traditional test that is solve in class with short time, individually and without external help. This scenario is not seen in real life. That's why it's not the best option. But if students are going to take one of those exams like TOEFL, it's important that they were trained for that. So it's important to use that tool sometimes. We have also the portfolios in which the student is asked to save all the documents of his or her writing process, drafts, edited versions, and the final versions, of course. But the final version is not the only one that is graded. It's important the whole process. And the final one is the written correction, the most common one. Also the one that takes more teacher's time because the teacher have to correct all the final version and that's it. And it can generate a lot of conflict and frustration in the student because the corrections could be a little biased and the student could be not agree with the teacher, could not agree with the teacher, and it will generate a lot of conflicts. Also, we have some scales in assessing a grading test. For example, there is the adaptation that relies more about dialect variety. For example, if it's a standard dialect or a local one, the formality level also. We have coherence, that is the paragraph structure, also the structure of the whole test or the whole text, depending on the genre. We have, for example, also the cohesion, that in which we evaluate connectors, punctuation, verbal text correlation, also the norm, orthography, lexical use, and also if there is some interference between the L2 and the L1. And finally, the variation, in which the lexical richness and expression resources are the most important ones. This is more about the personality of the student, what the student do in order to personalize their writing. The testing scales are important, but also the qualities of a good test are important. It relies in three different aspects in which we could find reliability, validity, and practicality. According to reliability, all the students have the same testing conditions and the same scoring criteria. It is important that it is fair and equal for all the students and no one is benefit with the task or with the scoring criteria. About validity, it is important that the score represents the real writing ability. So the task requires skills and knowledge that have already been taught. Students are not asked to do something that they don't know, and the criteria have to be clear for the teacher, and the teacher has to be familiarized with that criteria. Finally, the practicality is important for teachers to be realistic in the time they will use developing the task and scoring the responses. In order to finish this section, it is important to take into account the gradient prompts because students will perform different due to their context. It's not the same if they have some virtual aids or their different likes or dislikes. So sometimes it is a good strategy to write prompts about personal experiences. For example, it will be easier for them, but sometimes students could be benefit, some students could be benefit, and another other ones not, so it could be less reliable. The same for the choice of prompt, because students like to have the choice of the prompt, but sometimes they choose badly, make it less reliable. So teachers have to give the choices, and they are so similar that students will not have those problems. And finally, we have scoring. It is important, of course, to design or select a scoring rubric. And a recommendation is that divide the scores in content, organization, and the use of language. Because if we as teachers only give one one score, student will not identify their strengths and weaknesses that are important to develop their writing skills.
Hi everyone. Well, now let's remember that the exams are writing tasks that adopt a given prompt to be solved in a predetermined time, individually, and without any type of external consultation, only working with the information provided in the question itself. This is very common in language certification exams, even if this is not an exercise that resembles real life situations. It does suggest current problems or situations to be answered. So now let's see an example where we can see how writing is being assessed in the academic field. Well, this one is an example taken from one of the practice tests for the IELTS exam. That is, well, let's remember that the IELTS is the International English Language Testing System that certifies the English proficiency for academic or professional purposes. This exam is one of the most famous tests these days worldwide. So, as I said before, this is part of the IELTS practicing test, which consists of two parts. In the first one, normally a chart, a diagram, or a graph like this one is presented in order for the learner to describe the information that he, she, or they see, and they have to relate it to the context given at the beginning of the question. So if you see in task number 1, we have first a short text and then we have like this diagram. So let's check, let's read. The question says, the graph below shows the proportion of 4 different materials that were recycled from 1982 to 2010 in a particular country. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Write at least 150 words. Well, so here, as we see, something that is usual when assessing writing abilities is to give the learner a kind of model or material that serves as an inspiration for the written productions. It doesn't mean that the learner is going to write something out of nowhere. In other words, the material presented at the beginning of this question, both the text, the short text, and the diagram, serve as an input for the person to develop the requested task within the defined time and range of words that in this case and normally it is of at least 150 words. Well, now for the second part of the test, that is task number 2, we see that the situation changes a little bit. Here the task is a little more open, let's say, because now the objective is that the learner presents and defends his, her, or their point of view regarding a problematic situation, different from the previous one that was just like analyzing information and data. This one is different. The learner is free to express himself. So the question states the following. We have, well, task number 2, write about the following topic. Learning English at school is often seen as more important than learning local languages. If these are not taught, many are at risk of dying out. In your opinion, is it important for everyone to learn English? Should we try to ensure the survival of local languages, and if so, how? Give reasons for your answer and include any relevant examples from your own knowledge or experience. Write at least 250 words. Well, so in this test, task number 2, the learner is asked to give his or her personal opinion, because it says in your opinion. Is it important to say this or that? On a topic, this is a topic of general interest, okay? But of course, they have to follow a certain structure, in this case, the structure of an argumentative text. And also, they have a word limit that in this case is longer. They have 250 words, and it must be respected when answering the question, okay? So it's like more open, but still they have some parameters to be fulfilled. Now, for both parts of the writing test, we have seen already that on the one hand, it is intended to determine if the learner is able to describe and compare information. That is task number 1, the one with the diagram. And on the other hand, task number 2, if she, he, or they are able to present and justify structured opinions. Also, the quality of the information presented, following the structure, and the effectiveness in answering the questions are taken into account when scoring these type of tasks. In addition, with the production that results from these activities, it is also possible to determine the diversity of vocabulary, the grammatical accuracy in the presentation of the answers, the level of formality, the level of specification on the topic, spelling, of course, expressing resources, among others. Something that is appropriate to analyze for a certificate like this one, that has an academic focus. The idea of including several types of text in an exam like this one, because, well, you saw that in task number 1, the text was mostly descriptive, and on task number 2, the text was mostly argumentative. And this is due to the fact that in this way it can be evidenced that the learner knows and is able to adapt to the different types of texts without favoring any type of writing. Finally, to conclude, we present 4 statements. So, the first one that says that writing is an academic practice that involves more than the text production and relies on different perspectives to be carried out. This means that writing does not only involve the text, it is also about the process of planning, writing, revising, and modifying. And during the performance of the task, not only the prompt to be developed is taken into account, but also the learner is involved in the topic with the social context in which he or she develops. Okay, so that's important to the process of writing. And the second conclusion, we have that assessing writing has become important in the academic world because, well, of course, this is the primary mean, let's say, by which research, papers, and therefore knowledge are published and distributed. Then we have that it is that the writing production should demonstrate what the learner has acquired through the teacher. Okay, you cannot evaluate something as a teacher if you haven't shared it with your students first. And finally, the last conclusion we have is that technology, of course, plays a fundamental role nowadays. And although there are several programs that help with the scoring of this type of exams, it is important to emphasize that a computer, a machine, can never replace the role of a teacher when evaluating written productions, because is the teacher the one who is capable to interpret the meaning and the deeper content of a text. The computer can only follow instructions. Okay, it's the teacher who gives meaning to the text. Well, now that being said, thank you all for your attention. I hope you liked it, and bye bye.